July 1935. Off the northeastern Australian coast, a storm has whipped the ocean into violent turmoil. Southeasterly gales blow towards New Caledonia. Big passenger ships find refuge at anchorages to ride it out. Small fishing boats hide between islands to escape the raging waves. Lighthouse keepers at Sandy Cape, on the northern tip of Fraser Island, are given an unusual task: to keep an eye out for two ships, one of them a derelict with only a skeleton crew of 8 men aboard, drifting along by itself in the murk. They keep a vigilant watch, but nothing turns up, only the pounding waves and driving winds. It's feared the ship has been swallowed by the storm. But some days later, some surprising news comes through. They've survived. But their ship, well, it's well and truly beached. The towering hulk of the Maheno, the handsome old passenger liner, rears up from the sand at one of Australia's most remote coasts. The crew have camped out on the beach, exhausted but happy to simply be alive. Now the question arises, can their ship be saved? Ominously, day by day, a sandbank begins to rise up on the ship's starboard hull, which very well might stop it from being refloated. It's a race against time to save the Maheno, but time is very much not on the salvage crew's side. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm your friend Mike Brady from Oceanliner Designs, and this is the story of the ship stuck on the beach, the SS Maheno. Our story begins back in 1905, in June, when the elegant SS Maheno was launched at the renowned William Denny and Brothers Yard near Glasgow. The company was a major shareholder in New Zealand's Union Steamship Company, so even though that line's operations were way down over in the Southern Hemisphere, it was the Dumbarton-based shipyard that built almost all of their ships on the other side of the world. Scotland's shipyards were world leaders, after all, and Maheno was one in a long line of fine passenger ships built for operations in New Zealand and Australia. She wasn't very big, only 5,282 tonnes, but she served an important purpose, linking the big Australian mainland with New Zealand, a profitable route at the time which saw families, businessmen and workers frequently travelling the 2,800-kilometre, 1,700-mile voyage between the two nations. She was a pretty ship, slim with a long hull and 2 smartly proportioned funnels sitting atop a low superstructure with 2 long promenades for the passengers. The Tasman Sea and the Bass Strait can get very rough, so ships like Maheno had to be built with seaworthiness in mind. She was really a miniature version of the kind of transatlantic ocean liner that had won speed records in the years prior. In fact, from the side, she looks a bit like a baby version of the White Star Line's Oceanic. She was comfortable too, with more first-class passengers, 240, than the other 2 classes combined. I've only really been able to find 2 good shots from inside Maheno, both hosted on the brilliant website ssmaritime.com by the maritime historian Ruben Goossens. The main first-class salon looked plush, airy and light, complete with ceiling fans to handle the stifling summer heat. Meanwhile, down below, the dining saloon was classically Edwardian, with long tables, swivel chairs, and even more ceiling fans. This was typical stuff for ships of this vintage, but it was comfortable, and the trip across the Tasman Sea wasn't very long, only just shy of 3 days or so, thanks to the Maheno's fairly nippy top speed of about 19.5 knots. Her speed was partly thanks to her thin, knife-like hull, ideal for cleaving through the water, but also her secret weapon was down below. 3 propellers, each driven by Parsons' turbine. It meant Maheno held the Sydney to Wellington speed record for over 2 decades. For 9 years, the Maheno steamed happily along, visiting Dunedin, Wellington, Auckland, Melbourne, Sydney and Hobart. Not only that, but her excellent seakeeping characteristics meant she could operate big transocean voyages which sent her steaming all the way up to the US, Canada and back. She was one of the Union Steamship Company's darlings, but her engines gave some trouble, and she had to be re-equipped with just a pair of geared turbines instead, which no doubt impeded that impressive speed. Still, life was good for the Maheno, but then that calamitous year came along, 1914. The world's big passenger ships were mothballed or earmarked for service, and so too was Maheno. Her moment came in 1915, with Australian and New Zealand troops being wounded by their hundreds alongside their British comrades over in Turkey, at Gallipoli. The Empire had a sudden need for dozens of hospital ships to evacuate them for medical care. New Zealand recognised it had to do its part. The government petitioned the Governor-General for funds to strip Maheno back and turn her into a floating hospital ward. In July 1915, the newly christened HMNZ Maheno steamed off for the Mediterranean to help. Outside, she boasted a flash new paint scheme, with a green shear line, big red crosses, and her crimson funnels coated in brilliant white. Inside, she'd been thoroughly changed. Her salons and smoking rooms were turned instead into wards for hundreds of wounded men. Her crew was supplemented with a matron and 13 nurses, 5 medical officers, and 61 New Zealand Medical Corps orderlies, as well as a group of chaplains. Alongside the wards, 2 operating theatres were installed to help those lads who needed immediate, urgent care. Even as Maheno steamed off and made her way up to the theatre of operations, those men were being shot and bombed to bits. She couldn't get there fast enough. Maheno wasted no time. By late August, she had arrived at Mudros in Greece, a major staging point for naval operations in the Med. The very next day, she was put to work embarking those poor wounded who'd suffered badly in the Battle of Hill 60, which saw 1,100 killed or wounded. The ship's operating theatres proved a godsend. As the ship swung at anchor, the surgeons worked for 3 days non-stop until August 29th. Through 1916, she operated a cross-channel service for men wounded in the Somme and the Western Front. By 1918, the venerable hospital ship had certainly played her part, transporting some 25,000 sick and wounded men home, dodging U-boats and mines the whole time. By 1918, the ship was looking a little tired, and the armistice meant she could finally return home for good. Back on the passenger service she'd been designed for, Maheno went right back to it, even steaming so far as England on 6 separate voyages. Time, however, had taken its toll. The Union Steamship Company was laying the groundwork for new and improved ships and were just about to order the spectacular SS Awatea, a glamorous Art Deco palace. Poor old Maheno just couldn't hope to keep up with ships like this. In 1935, the 30-year-old steamer was finally retired from service and put on the market. If she'd been sold just after the war, she might have found a buyer in another line, but now, in the 30s, passenger ships had advanced so much that the Maheno looked little more than a museum piece. She was snapped up by Japanese scrappers, Taminosuke Miyachi from Osaka. For Maheno, it looked like it was the end of the road. First, though, she'd have to make one last voyage. As it turned out, Maheno was not the only ship sold to Miyachi. The old Una, a small steamer built back in 1888 for services between Tasmania and Melbourne, was to be broken up as well. The new buyers came up with a seemingly brilliant plan: have the out-of-commission Maheno taken under tow by the smaller Una. It would be more economical, meaning the company wouldn't need to stock Maheno's holds with hundreds of tons of coal for the long voyage, only the Unas. To prepare Maheno for the long trip, her twin propellers were taken off to prevent drag. For the voyage, an 8,300-kilometre, 5,100-mile ocean-going trek, the Una would be the mothership with 30 or so aboard, while a small crew would stay aboard Maheno to make sure all was well. 8 Japanese crew were berthed on Maheno. On Una's bridge, Captain Hashimoto would oversee the operation. They set out from Sydney on July 3rd, the tow lines straining as the little Una's engines chugged along, towing the big old liner that was about 3 times bigger than her. They'd not be breaking any speed records. The crew settled in for what promised to be a lengthy journey, about a month. 4 days later, they'd only managed about 700 miles, that's 1,100 kilometres at an average speed of somewhere around 6 knots, when they ran into trouble. Off Queensland, the 2 ships were caught out by that massive storm, which developed into a tropical cyclone. On shore, there came a worried message from the Una, garbled by the atmospheric conditions and the Japanese operator's English, that the ship's steering gear had broken down. This was a possible death sentence for any ship in a big sea that would mean it couldn't keep its bow pointed into the worst of the weather. With her rudder out of action, the little Una was buffeted by massive waves, and the Maheno behind her acted like a giant 5,200-ton sea anchor. It proved too much. The towing cable, 6.5 inches or 12 centimetres thick, snapped like a piece of straw. The 2 ships were driven almost immediately apart until, from the bridge of Una, the old Maheno had simply disappeared into the squall. It is generally believed, read the Western Mail, that any vessel not under steam would not be able to remain afloat in the heavy seas outside Hervey Bay. Una radioed in sporadically throughout the storm to report her steering gear was under repair, but she was holding her own. No distress call had been sent, but the radio station at Pinkenba asked if Una needed assistance. Send assistance for the Maheno, Una's wireless fired back. Maheno was gone, with no way of radioing her position because without fires up and steam on her boilers, there was no way to generate power for her wireless. She was out there somewhere being buffeted around like a toy. Perhaps she was already sunk. At Brisbane, a tug, the Carlock, was called and made ready to rush out and find the old liner if she was still afloat. For the salvage crew, it could prove to be a profitable job if they could pull it off. First, though, they'd have to deal with the storm. For 24 hours it raged, its worst centred somewhere over the Maheno's last known position, until finally it moved on out to sea and things at last calmed down a bit. Una had been hove to, riding out the worst of the weather, but finally her engines chugged again into life in search of her missing companion. In the distance was the eastern shore of Fraser Island, today called Gari, 130 kilometres or 78 miles of nearly uninterrupted sandy beach, on an island that juts out from Queensland's coast. It's an idyllic, remote spot. Through their binoculars, Una's crew saw something they couldn't believe. It was Maheno, not sunk or smashed to pieces, but sitting perfectly upright on the beach. From the shore waved 8 small figures who screamed out, "Una, Una," at the tops of their lungs. One waved a Japanese flag. They were mighty glad to see them. It was actually a New England Airways plane that had first spotted the ship back on July 10th. From the air, they too could see the men waving frantically and the Maheno beached firmly, an anchor out but with heavy waves breaking on her exposed hull. She sat parallel to the coast, with her starboard side totally exposed to the ocean. Already, a sandbank was building up on that side. It threatened to lock the Maheno in. Even then, the morning bulletin from Queensland reported that there was only remote chance of saving the ship. As it happened, probably to save on costs, the Japanese owners had neglected to insure their ship for the long tow. None of this mattered to Maheno's small crew though. They'd beaten the odds and they'd survived a terrifying ordeal. For 24 hours, their ship had been completely at the mercy of the big seas, battered about like a toy and at risk of sinking any minute. They went through many sleepless hours, reported the Courier Mail, a nerve-shattering experience. Maheno's young skipper, Tanaka, reported the ship had gently glided to a stop on the beach, without the kind of heavy impact you might expect from a 5,300-ton ship ramming the land. The crew were glad to be stationary at last, and as the storm abated, they ventured down on ladders and found they could actually simply walk to land at low tide. They set up a small camp on shore, maybe for fear Maheno might be suddenly refloated and dragged back out to sea to sink, and they waited. Then came the aeroplane, and 21 hours later, the Una. Rescuers eventually reached the men and found their tents with clotheslines strung between the trees. Captain Tanaka excitedly explained how he had abandoned his ship in the customary manner, the last one off after having sounded the ship's whistle and bell twice for good measure. The Courier Mail even sent a correspondent and a photographer, but since there was only one car on the island, they had to hitch a ride on a small motor launch and then trek 14 miles on soft ground just to get there. Maheno's grounding raised some unusual questions. Were the crew now illegal immigrants? Were any of the ship's provisions dutiable for customs? Well, fortunately, the government erred on the side of empathy and the crew were treated as guests and not migrants. Meanwhile, Captain Hashimoto on the Una decided to visit the wreck himself and confer with Tanaka. An extensive examination showed that the Maheno was stuck fast, with a list of 12.5 degrees over to one side, at starboard. Shore anchors were installed to prevent her from accidentally refloating and drifting out to sea again. To the Japanese captains, it seemed clear even then that Maheno wasn't going anywhere. At high tide, about 27 feet of water filled her engine rooms, and waves poured through her portholes. Una's crew began to strip the ship of virtually everything of value to prepare it to transport across the island to their ship waiting on the other side. All the furniture, the lights, the chandeliers, all that finery, it would all have to be taken out by hand and carefully winched over the side onto the beach. Maheno couldn't be refloated. The Japanese shipbreakers lost something to the tune of £17,000 for the mishap, which back then was a small fortune, and the old Union liner was left where she sat. Una turned for Japan and steamed on by herself, leaving Maheno's 8 men, including Captain Tanaka, behind. Australian customs officers had to stay behind too, to oversee things as a formality. One of them, Dudley Weatherly, had delayed his wedding 3 times on Maheno's behalf. Clearly his fiancée was not amused. The stranded liner became the venue for one of history's strangest wedding ceremonies, as Weatherly sought Captain Tanaka's permission to host the event on board. At low tide, guests flocked, scaled a 9-metre, 30-foot tall ladder up the hull, and gathered in the salon as strains of music from the ship's organ welcomed the bride. By late January 1936, most of the luxurious fittings had been auctioned off. The duties paid to customs and the Japanese owners were finally finished with Maheno. They desperately sought a buyer, but with the ship's plate seams now leaking water, it was clear she was completely doomed. She became a popular haunt for tourists and fishermen who used her bulk as a shelter on remote trips. But in the Second World War, she was used as a practice bombing range for the Royal Australian Air Force, who skimmed her mastheads with Beaufort bombers. By the 50s, the old ship had broken in two, with her stern sunk well into the sand. In 1985, locals gathered for a commemoration of 50 years since the ship's stranding. Clearly, she had become a local legend, something of a rusting celebrity. Today, she's still there, exactly where Captain Tanaka and his 7 crewmen left her. Her hull plates have virtually all been eaten through, leaving behind only the frames and beams, like a kind of big metal skeleton. The superstructure, with its long promenades and its bridge, the twin funnels and the masts, they've all collapsed and been eaten by the sea. Now, only the hull remains, still recognisable as a passenger steamer thanks to that iconic shape of her bow and the hawse pipes which once carried her anchors. She's still a popular attraction for four-wheel drivers, fishermen and tourists just exploring the beautiful island itself. Her hulking remains are a reminder of one of Australian maritime history's bizarre chapters, the day a luxury liner and a war hero of a ship ran aground on the beach.